Dawn had not yet broken over the Loire when the world split apart. For hours the night had been silent, a silence thick with the damp breath of spring and the slow ticking of occupation. Then came the sound. First, the low hum of an engine somewhere beyond the river, then a grinding tremor beneath the soil. In the gray half-light before sunrise, a German supply train, 40 cars long, each loaded with munitions, fuel, and men, curved along the narrow viaduct outside Saint-Georges-sur-Loire. The air smelled faintly of oil and wet stone. On the embankment, dew clung to the wild grass like frost, and then a flash. A heartbeat of pure white, and the bridge erupted. The explosion did not thunder. It ripped. It tore open the air with the raw, shattering scream of iron giving way to nothing. For a split second, the bridge hung in midair like a toy broken by invisible hands, its center vanishing in a swirl of smoke and fire. Cars lifted from the track as though weightless, men thrown from the locomotive cab before they could even shout. The shockwave rolled through the valley, breaking windows, setting off the alarm of every bird in the forest. And when the echo died, all that was left was fire and the long, wailing cry of twisted steel collapsing into the river below. By the time the first Gestapo vehicles reached the scene, the smoke still climbed in pillars hundreds of meters high. Their boots sank in mud slicked with oil. The rails were split open like veins. Crates of ammunition hissed and detonated in the embers, and among the wreckage, scrawled in white chalk across a surviving stone wall, the symbol of the Cross of Lorraine. It was not the work of saboteurs. It was not even the work of soldiers. It was the work of a handful of farmers, miners, and students, the Maquisards of Anjou, who had crawled through the dark under the noses of the German occupation, wired the bridge with explosives salvaged from old mines, and vanished into the mist before dawn. Men and women who would never see their names printed in the papers, whose graves would remain unmarked in the hills. But in that moment, when the train fell and the valley roared, the French resistance had struck one of its most decisive blows of the war. By sunrise, Gestapo patrols swept through the nearby villages, smashing doors, burning barns, dragging men into the streets. The smell of cordite still lingered in the wind. Somewhere deep in the woods, hidden in a damp cave near the river, 4 partisans listened to the distant chaos and dared to breathe again. One of them, a young woman with a streak of soot across her face, whispered, "It worked." And when the echo of the last explosion faded into the morning haze, the resistance began its most dangerous hour. Not the mission itself, but the price of its success. The hunt had begun. The morning after the explosion, the Loire Valley still smoldered. Ash floated in the mist like snowfall, settling on the silent farms that stretched between Angers and Saint-Georges. The Germans had sealed every road by noon, sandbag checkpoints, trucks mounted with MG-34s, dogs pacing in the mud. Every civilian was ordered to remain inside. Every barn, attic, and cellar was searched. But the men they hunted were already gone, ghosts dissolving into the forests that stitched the French countryside together like green veins. For months before that morning, the plan had lived only as a whisper, passed in secret through the resistance like the soft rustle of leaves in the wind. It had begun with one man, Jean Delattre, a former railway engineer from Tours, stripped of his post after refusing to pledge loyalty to Vichy. He had watched the occupation tighten like a noose, the Gestapo offices filling the cafes, the posters warning of execution for sabotage, the quiet betrayals in every village square. But Jean had something most others did not: access. He knew the train schedules, the fuel routes, and the men who still operated the lines under German command. He met them in shadows, railwaymen with grease under their nails, men who spoke little but knew how to listen. Through them, he learned that a weekly munitions train left the German depot at Chateaubriand every Thursday at 03 hours, carrying fuel and ammunition toward Normandy. If the resistance could cripple that line, it would paralyze the entire northern corridor for days, perhaps weeks. The problem wasn't the train. It was the bridge. The Saint-Georges Viaduct, built in 1891, 3 arches of stone and iron spanning the river, had been reinforced by the Wehrmacht and guarded by 2 machine gun posts. Beneath it ran the only surviving fuel pipe between the depot and the Angers airfield. Blowing it up meant striking a wound the Germans could not hide. But it also meant suicide. Still, the message spread. Through the forests, through coded notes slipped inside bread loaves and cigarette papers, through old friends meeting by chance at the market. The word was simple. The bridge must fall. Jean reached out to Lucien Maréchal, a farmer's son turned courier for the Maquis of Anjou. Lucien was 21, thin, restless, with the kind of eyes that never stopped scanning the tree line. His bicycle carried messages wrapped in wax and tucked inside the handlebars, each addressed to names that existed nowhere on paper. Together they found the others. René Pichon, a former miner who still kept dynamite hidden in a false wall behind his barn. Hélène Arnaud, a schoolteacher from Saumur whose brother had been deported to Mauthausen. She spoke fluent German and had a talent for forgery that fooled even the local commandantur. And Father Émile Lefort, the village priest, who had turned confession into espionage, gathering whispers from terrified villagers and passing them to the resistance under the guise of prayer. They met for the first time in March 1943, inside the abandoned wine cellar of Château de la Roche, its walls slick with moisture, its air cold and heavy with the scent of old earth. A single candle burned on a crate between them, its flame trembling in the draught. Jean spread out the railway map, creased, stained, marked with charcoal lines. He traced the route of the train with his finger. "Here," he said. "The incline begins just before the viaduct. It slows to 20 kilometers an hour. We'll need 2 charges, one under the central arch, one near the support column. If we cut the line on both sides, they won't see it until it's too late." Hélène leaned forward. "How much explosive?" René answered. "Enough to wake the whole of France." There was silence after that. Outside, a nightingale sang in the vines. Inside, the candle sputtered, and Jean looked at the faces around him, each one calm, resigned, already carrying the weight of what it meant. They all knew the price. For every German train destroyed, 10 French hostages were shot. For every bridge blown, a village burned. Still, they nodded. In the weeks that followed, they built a web of quiet miracles. René smuggled powder from an abandoned quarry, packing it into flour sacks and covering it with hay. Hélène stole ration stamps and typewriter ribbons, forging new identification papers with the ink from melted shoe polish. Jean rewired detonators using old telegraph cables. Father Émile hid the supplies inside the church's crypt, beneath the marble effigy of a forgotten saint, whose hollow base became a cache for death. But even the strongest network was porous. There were eyes everywhere. Gestapo informant, a cafe owner in Angers named Gaston Rouvier, noticed the same young courier arriving every Tuesday with bread for the priest. He mentioned it to a local German officer over a drink, earning a few extra francs and a promise of safety. Within a week, the Gestapo had begun tracing the movements of the courier. Lucien knew nothing of it when he pedaled through the morning fog, his coat collar up, a letter folded inside his boot. The letter contained the final coordinates for the detonation. He was 20 meters from the bridge when the first black car appeared on the road behind him. He turned off the path, cutting through a field of barley, tires churning the wet earth. The sound of the engine grew louder. He dropped the bicycle and ran, the letter pressed against his chest, his breath ragged. Bullets tore through the mist, single shots sharp as whips. One struck the ground beside him, spraying mud into his face. He stumbled, rolled behind a fallen tree, tore the letter in half, then again and again, shoving the pieces into his mouth until they dissolved into pulp. When the Germans found him, he was unconscious, but alive. The papers were gone. They interrogated him for 2 days in anger, beating him until he could no longer stand. He said nothing. That night, a power outage hit the entire district, a fuse accidentally pulled by a sympathetic technician at the station. When the lights came back on, Lucien was gone. The guards found only an open window and a rope made from torn bedsheets leading down the wall. He had crawled into the sewers, bleeding, and emerged 4 kilometers away near the riverbank, where a fisherman took him in. He reappeared 3 nights later in the cellar. His face was swollen, his voice broken, but his eyes burned brighter than ever. "Tomorrow," he said. "We do it tomorrow night." Jean looked at him, at the bruises, at the trembling hands, and knew there would be no other chance. The Germans were tightening their patrols. The railway guards had doubled. Every delay risked discovery. And so, as the clock struck midnight on April 6, 1943, the Maquisards of Anjou gathered for what they all believed would be their final act. Outside, the wind carried the scent of rain. Inside, the candle flame steadied, and the bridge waited, sleeping under the stars. The wind off the Loire carried the taste of rain and rust that night. a soft drizzle whispering across the meadows, wetting the tall grass that hid the path toward the viaduct. By midnight the moon was gone, swallowed by a ceiling of cloud so low it pressed against the treetops. It was the kind of darkness that erased everything. Road, sky, horizon, even sound seemed to vanish into it. The Maquisards moved like shadows through the wet undergrowth, each step sinking silently into the earth. They carried nothing that clinked, nothing that could betray them. Just small packs of explosives wrapped in cloth, the fuses coiled tight like veins of black rope. Jean led them, his breath measured, one hand brushing the moss-covered stones along the path to feel his way. Behind him came Lucien, limping slightly, his coat torn from the escape days earlier. He carried the detonator in a tin box against his chest, every beat of his heart feeling like it might trigger it. Hélène followed third, her scarf tied under her chin, eyes reflecting what little light there was. She had spent the last hours destroying every trace of her forged documents, burning them page by page, watching the flames die quietly in a kitchen sink. She knew she would not return to her home in Saumur after this. She whispered a prayer under her breath in German, a language she had learned in peace and now used for war. Behind them trudged René, the explosives man, his thick hands steady despite the cold. His pack weighed nearly 20 kilos, the dynamite wrapped in flour sacks and bound with wire scavenged from telephone lines. He hummed softly under his breath, an old mining song about tunnels and smoke. The last man was Father Emile, the priest, his black cassock replaced with a worker's coat, the collar still turned up against the wind. He carried only a pistol and a small wooden cross in his pocket. They reached the tree line by 1 a.m. Through the branches they could see it, the viaduct enormous and spectral, its arches rising out of the mist like the ribs of some ancient creature. The faint reflection of its stone curve shimmered in the water below. No light, no guards visible, but they knew better. The Germans had stationed 2 sentries at either end of the span, plus a roving patrol that passed every 30 minutes. Somewhere beneath the bridge, a small bunker housed a radio operator. Their line to anger, Jean crouched behind a fallen log and raised a hand. They all stopped. He looked at Lucien. Once we cross the embankment, there's no turning back. Lucien nodded, pale, lips pressed thin. There's no before anymore, he said quietly. They split into 2 teams. Jean and René would crawl beneath the central arch to plant the primary charge at the load-bearing column. Lucien, Hélène, and Father Emile would handle the diversion, cutting the signal wire, setting a decoy fuse to draw the guards away. The entire plan depended on silence. If the sentries saw them before the timer was set, there would be no chance to detonate remotely. They began the descent. The slope beneath the bridge was slick, a tangle of roots and gravel. Jean slid the last few meters on his stomach, hands pressed into the mud. He could hear the river below, a dull, endless current sliding between rocks. The air was colder down here, filled with the smell of damp iron. He could feel the weight of the structure above, thousands of tons of stone humming with the faint vibration of distant trains. René unstrapped his pack. They worked quickly, fingers numb, arranging the sticks of dynamite in bundles of 6. The detonator caps clicked softly as they twisted them in. Every sound felt magnified in the silence, the drip of water, the soft scuff of boots, even the beating of their hearts. Above, Lucien and Hélène reached the guard post. 2 Germans stood by a lantern smoking, rifles slung across their shoulders. Hélène watched them through the fog, counting their steps. Every 40 seconds they switched positions. Perfectly timed. Lucien slid along the ditch, cutting through the communications wire with a rusted pair of pliers. Sparks flickered and died. Father Emile, standing watch, clutched his small pistol but prayed he wouldn't have to use it. When one guard turned away, Hélène rose from the grass and walked straight toward the light. Unarmed, calm, her coat pulled tight. For a second, the sentry froze, uncertain what he was seeing. A woman in the middle of nowhere at night under curfew. Then he barked something sharp in German, raising his weapon. Hélène smiled faintly. Ich habe mich verlaufen, she said. I am lost. Her accent was flawless, soft, provincial. The soldier hesitated, lowering his rifle a fraction. That was all they needed. Lucien darted forward from behind, swinging a length of wood across the man's throat. The other guard turned, reaching for his gun, and Father Emile fired once. The sound cracked the night, deafening, final. Both men fell. Hélène's hands trembled, but she said nothing. The priest crossed himself once, lips moving silently. Below, Jean heard the shot. He froze. Then, with a grim certainty, he pressed the final charge into place. Too late to stop now, he muttered. René set the timer, 15 minutes. They scrambled up the embankment, slipping, gasping. Mud streaked their coats. The first shouts echoed through the fog, the German patrol reacting to the gunfire. Flashlights flickered on the far bank. Jean reached the top, waving frantically for the others. Go now! Lucien lifted the detonator box, snapping the line into place. He looked once toward the bridge, the shape of it barely visible through smoke and mist. Then he pressed the trigger. A hiss, a spark, a heartbeat, and the world turned white. The explosion hit like thunder rolling from the ground upward. The air became fire. The viaduct's central arch shattered, stone exploding outward in massive shards. The train that had been idling at the far signal lurched as rails bent beneath it. One after another, carriages split open, ammunition igniting in a chain of orange fireballs that lit the valley like dawn. The blast wave threw the maquisards to the earth. Dirt rained from the sky. For a moment no one could hear, only a high, thin ringing. Then slowly the sound of the river returned. Crickets, the groan of metal collapsing into water. Jean staggered to his feet, ears bleeding, staring at the inferno below. The bridge was gone, half of it sinking into the river like a dying beast. René laughed wild and hoarse. Mon Dieu, we did it. But the laughter died quickly. Far down the road, truck engines roared. Gestapo reinforcements already on their way from Angers. Headlights pierced the mist like searchlights. Jean turned to the others. Into the woods, move! They vanished among the trees just as the first bullet snapped through the air. The Germans were firing blind, rage more than aim. A flare burst overhead, turning the forest silver. The resistance sprinted through mud and roots, lungs burning, boots slipping. Lucien stumbled once, clutching his side. Hélène grabbed his arm and dragged him onward. Behind them, the light of the burning bridge glowed against the horizon like a second sunrise. The last thing they saw before the darkness closed around them. By dawn, they had disappeared into the forest. 5 figures swallowed by mist and silence, leaving behind only smoke, shattered rails, and the echo of history rewritten in fire. Dawn came slow and red that morning, spreading over the Loire like spilled blood. Smoke still curled from the ruins of the Saint-Georges viaduct, drifting across the water in long, ghostly ribbons. The air reeked of oil, ash, and burned timber. From miles away, the black plume could be seen rising against the pale horizon, a beacon of defiance, and an open wound in the face of the occupation. By 6 a.m., the Germans had sealed every road within 15 kilometers. Convoys of black Mercedes and gray Opel trucks rolled through the villages, their engines growling, windshields glistening with rain. Gestapo agents in long leather coats stepped out in silence, eyes hidden behind caps. They carried lists, names gathered over months of surveillance, scribbled by informants, whispered by frightened neighbors. The operation had a name, Action Donnerfaust, Operation Thunderfist. At the head of the detachment was Obersturmführer Karl Wirth, a veteran of the Eastern Front, transferred west after a leg injury. His face was pale, angular, his manner precise to the point of cruelty. He walked with a cane that clicked on the cobblestones like a metronome. Wirth did not raise his voice. He did not need to. When he entered a room, silence arrived before him. He surveyed the wreckage of the viaduct from the embankment, the wind pulling at his coat. Behind him, engineers shouted measurements, scribbling reports. Wirth simply watched. The burned rails, the twisted remains of a locomotive half submerged. The bodies of soldiers still being pulled from the water. Resistance, he murmured, almost to himself. They think they can wound us with toys, then turning to his adjutant, find them. Every last one. The first arrests began within hours. In Saint-Georges, soldiers stormed the bakery, the post office, the rectory. Men were dragged into the square, forced to kneel in the mud while the Gestapo questioned them one by one. The answers didn't matter. The act of asking was punishment enough. By noon, 10 villagers were dead. Their bodies were left as a warning, hanging from telegraph poles, names scrawled on cardboard signs that read Saboteur. In Angers, the Gestapo headquarters, a commandeered mansion on Rue Saint-Lô, became a hive of interrogation. The air inside was hot and damp, the windows covered in blackout curtains. Wirth oversaw every session personally. He was methodical, almost gentle, until the moment he wasn't. One prisoner, a captured courier from another cell, gave them the first lead, a name half spoken through broken teeth. Delattre. That evening, Worth's men surrounded Jean Delatre's small cottage near the railway yard. Inside, they found only an empty bed and a still warm cup of coffee. On the table lay a single sheet of paper, blank except for a small burned hole in the center. He had known they were coming. While the Gestapo scoured the valley, the Maquisards hid deeper in the forest. For 3 days they moved without fire or light, sleeping beneath branches, drinking from the river. Their clothes were soaked, their hands raw from cold. Lucien's wound had worsened. The bullet that grazed him during the escape had left his side swollen and feverish. Hélène tended to him as best she could, wrapping his torso with strips torn from her scarf. Jean rationed what little bread they had, saving the last piece for Lucien. "He's just a boy," he said. "He needs it more." René disagreed. "We all need it more. We'll die out here if we don't move." But there was nowhere to go. The Gestapo checkpoints had reached even the back roads. The radio reports warned of house-to-house searches. The resistance network was collapsing under pressure, couriers vanishing, safe houses burned. That night, Father Emile gathered them in a hollow beneath the trees. The moonlight barely touched their faces. "We have done God's work," he said softly. "But the devil always comes to collect." Jean looked up at him. "You think he still listens to men like us?" The priest smiled faintly. "Especially to men like us." On the 4th day, they heard the truck's engines, distant but growing. Jean signaled silence. They lay flat in the undergrowth as the convoy passed on the road below. 3 trucks full of German troops, helmets glinting. On the side of one, stenciled in black letters, Giesti. APO. The last truck carried villagers, bound, blindfolded, their heads hanging. Jean counted 12. Among them, through the cracks in the tarp, he saw a face he knew. Father Lefort's brother, taken from his farm that morning. The priest's hand trembled as he reached for his pistol. Jean caught his wrist. "Not now. Not like this." Emile closed his eyes and began to pray. When the sound of the engines faded, only silence remained. A silence that felt heavier than the explosion itself. Lucien broke it. "If we stay still, they'll find us anyway." Jean nodded. "Then we move tonight." By dusk, the resistance split. René and Jean would head north to contact another cell near Laval. Hélène and Lucien would seek shelter with partisans rumored to operate near Saumur. Father Emile insisted on staying behind to guide refugees fleeing the searches. He embraced each of them before they left, pressing a small crucifix into Lucien's hand. "If you live through this," he whispered, "bury it in the ruins of the church. Then you'll know France lives again." 2 nights later, the Gestapo found the cave. A patrol of local militiamen, guided by Rouvier, the same cafe owner who had betrayed Lucien weeks before, followed footprints along the riverbank to a patch of disturbed earth. Beneath it, they found empty crates marked with German ammunition stamps and a charred piece of wire. By morning, a full detachment surrounded the forest. Hélène woke to the sound of dogs barking. The first shots cracked through the trees before she could even reach Lucien's side. Jean and René had not returned. The air filled with shouts in German, the snap of branches, the scream of bullets cutting through leaves. Lucien struggled to stand, his face white with fever. "Go," he said. "Go now." Hélène shook her head, dragging him toward the stream. They crawled through the mud, water splashing against their hands. The dogs were closer. A flare burst above the canopy, turning night into a nightmare of silver and smoke. Hélène fired twice behind her, then again. Lucien collapsed beside her, whispering, "It's cold." She held him, pressing her hand over the wound that would not stop bleeding. His breath faded with the dawn. By the time the Gestapo reached the bank, there was only her. They found Elaine standing waist-deep in the water, hands raised, face pale and calm. The cross still hung from her neck. Worth himself arrived minutes later. He studied her for a long moment. "You speak German," he said. "Yes," she answered softly. "Better than you speak French." He struck her once with his cane. "You will tell me who helped you." She did not respond. They dragged her to the trucks. That afternoon, in the square at Saint-Georges, the Germans assembled the townspeople. Worth read from a paper in his gloved hand, his voice flat. "For the act of sabotage committed against the Reich on April 6th, 20 citizens will pay the price." Behind him, a firing squad waited. Hélène Arnaud stood at the front of the line. Her eyes found the horizon, the same river, the same bridge now lying in ruins. She did not flinch. When the rifles fired, the birds rose from the trees all at once, black against the sky, scattering into the light. Far away, in a barn north of Laval, Jean Delattre and René Pichon heard the gunfire echo faintly across the valley. Neither spoke. Jean simply closed his eyes. "They're gone," he said. "All of them." René placed a hand on his shoulder. "Then we finish what they began." The next morning, they picked up their weapons, crossed the line of German patrols, and vanished into the hills, 2 men carrying the last embers of the Anjou resistance. The Gestapo burned Saint-Georges that night. The flames reached the sky, but beneath the ashes, buried deep in the church ruins, the small wooden cross that Father Émile had given still remained, untouched, waiting. Rain fell again over the valley that week. Slow, deliberate rain that blurred the scorched outlines of Saint-Georges until the village looked half erased from the world. From the hills above Angers, the last survivors of the Anjou cell watched the smoke rising through the mist and swore they would never forget it. Jean Delattre no longer spoke much. His hands shook when he tried to light a cigarette. His eyes were ringed with ash-colored circles that made him look older than his 38 years. René stayed close, silent except for the small mechanical rhythms of a man building things, checking fuses, counting bullets, oiling the old Sten gun that had jammed during the escape. Both men knew they were already ghosts walking among the living, but word of the bridge had spread. Across the Loire in the forests of Cholet, partisans whispered that Anjou had struck a mortal blow. The Germans had lost an entire munitions convoy. Supply lines to Normandy were crippled for 10 days. For the first time in months, the resistance felt something like breath again. The martyrdom of Saint-Georges became their rallying cry. Jean and René reached a safe house near the hamlet of Bouzillet, an abandoned farmhouse used by the Armée Secrète, the clandestine military wing uniting scattered groups under General Delestrance's command. Inside the damp stone walls, new faces gathered. Parachuted agents from London, local farmers, escaped POWs, even a few deserters from Vichy police. They spoke in low voices, passing around maps under a flickering oil lamp. The plan was simple and impossible. Strike the Germans before they could crush the region completely. They called it Operation Vengeance. Jean unfolded the map of the Loire rail corridor, its surface pocked with fingerprints and candle wax. His voice, hoarse but steady, filled the room. "We've lost friends. We've lost villages, but they think we've lost our will. That's their mistake." He pointed to 3 targets: the fuel depot near Angers Airfield, the communication tower at Ingrandes, and the German motor column expected to cross the Laon Bridge by the week's end. "We'll hit all 3. One night, one message," no one argued. In war, grief often becomes command. That night, the farmhouse became a forge. René worked with 2 young miners to shape crude bombs from wine bottles and petrol. A radio operator tuned into London, sending a coded burst through static. "Le pont a parlé. Le feu suivra. The bridge has spoken. The fire will follow." At midnight, a voice answered in Morse, "God save France, supplies incoming." Within days, parachutes fell over the fields, canvas bundles with Brennes, stands and explosives wrapped in oilcloth. It was the first time the Maquis of Anjou had real weapons. Among the new arrivals was Lieutenant Edward Collins, a British SOE agent barely 26 with sharp eyes and a clipped accent that sounded alien against the thick French murmurs. He carried a small suitcase radio and an unwavering calm. When he shook Jean's hand, he said simply, "I heard about your bridge. London did too. They send their respect." Jean nodded. "Respect won't rebuild Saint-Georges." Collins met his gaze. "No, but bullets might." For the first time since the execution square, Jean smiled. The rain stopped the night they struck. The valley lay under a pale, trembling moon. From the forest near Brissac, 3 teams moved out in silence, each carrying the weight of ghosts on their backs. Jean led the group bound for the Angers fuel depot. They crossed through orchards and vineyards, their boots whispering through wet grass. The depot loomed ahead, 12 massive storage tanks ringed by barbed wire, guarded by 2 machine gun towers. German sentries paced in pairs, their cigarettes glowing like small beacons in the dark. René crouched beside a ditch, unwrapping the explosives. Same as before? Jean nodded. Except this time we leave nothing standing. They slipped through a drainage culvert, emerging behind a row of oil drums. Jean's heart hammered in his throat as he clipped the first wire. Sparks snapped like insects in the dark. Within minutes, 5 charges were set along the base of the tanks. He lit the timer, whispered a single name, Hélène, and motioned to retreat. At Aura 1, 14 hours, the depot erupted. A column of flame tore through the sky, turning night to day. The shockwave rolled across the valley, rattling windows 20 kilometers away. The Germans never saw the saboteurs vanish into the orchards. Simultaneously, 30 kilometers west, the second team struck the Engrande's radio tower. Lightning without a storm, the steel mast folding in on itself under the weight of dynamite. Sparks rained across the riverbank. Communication between Angers and Nantes went dark. In the chaos, German patrols raced blind through the countryside. Engines snarling, headlights off, hunting phantoms in the dark. The third team waited near the Léon Bridge, where the motor column was expected before dawn. René, guiding them by memory, positioned a mine beneath the center span. When the first truck crossed, the bridge vanished in a roar of fire and shrapnel. Flames swallowed the convoy, lighting the river in orange reflections that flickered like Hell's Gate. By sunrise, the Loire corridor was in chaos. The Gestapo headquarters at Angers burned for hours. Wirth's cane clicked furiously across the marble floors as he barked orders, his calm veneer gone. Seal the region. Execute every suspect. The resistance dies here, but it didn't, it multiplied. In the forest, celebration was quiet and exhausted, hollow yet real. Jean sat by the ashes of a small fire, staring at the horizon. Collins poured him a measure of brandy from his canteen. "You understand what you've started," the Englishman said. Jean nodded. "A war inside a war. Then you'll need London's help." "I don't need London," Jean said softly. "I need France." He looked at the faint glimmer of smoke rising from Angers and knew the reprisals would be merciless. But for the first time since Hélène's death, he felt something more powerful than grief. Momentum. The occupation had fractured. Fear had changed sides. By the spring of 1944, the Loire Valley breathed smoke instead of air. The resistance had become a river, branching in every direction, carrying messages, weapons, and vengeance from one hidden camp to another. Each act of sabotage fed the next. Each captured maquisard became a story that spread faster than fear. The Gestapo was unraveling under its own violence. Jean Delattre, the engineer turned saboteur, no longer resembled the man who had first drawn the plan of the viaduct. His beard was gray now, his coat patched with burns, his hands permanently stained with grease. He had spent weeks moving from forest to forest, training new fighters, miners, farmers, even children, to handle Sten guns and grenades dropped from the black bellies of Allied planes. He had not slept a full night in months, but every dawn he woke to the same thought: we are winning. René was gone, killed in a raid near Cholet, covering the escape of a convoy smuggling Allied pilots toward Brittany. They buried him under a grove of chestnuts, marking the grave only with a knife driven into the soil. Jean never wept. He couldn't. There was too much left to do. The resistance, once a whisper, had become a chorus. Groups that had fought separately now moved under a single name: the Forces Françaises de l'Intérieur, the FFI. Jean served as liaison for the Anjou sector, coordinating with the British SOE and the American OSS. His codename was Argonne. Through him, the Loire lit up with signals and explosions that carved the occupiers' confidence into dust. When the Normandy landings began in June, the Loire erupted. Bridges collapsed in the night. Telegraph lines vanished. Trains derailed. German columns were ambushed in forests they had once marched through unchallenged. For the first time, the sky belonged to the Allies. The sound of distant bombers was a hymn. Jean and a dozen partisans set up their command post inside the ruins of a monastery north of Angers. Moss covered the stones where monks had once prayed. The bell tower was gone, shelled weeks earlier, but the crypt below made the perfect shelter for a radio. Lieutenant Collins was still there, thinner, quieter but unbroken. He tuned his receiver endlessly, headphones pressed to his ears, waiting for the signal from London. One night, as thunder rolled over the valley, the radio cracked through the static. "Stand by for the dawn." Collins looked up, eyes wide. "It's time." The Allies are coming south. Angers must rise tomorrow. Jean stared at the map. Every route, every German checkpoint, every supply line. His hands shook as he traced them. Tomorrow would decide everything, not just for the Maquis, but for France itself. He stood. Then we'll light the road for them. The next day, July 6, 1944, the sun climbed over a valley already filled with smoke. Resistance fighters in patched uniforms and mismatched helmets emerged from the forests like ghosts returning to life. Farmers handed them rifles hidden under hay. Priests gave them last rites in barns. Women carried bandages, food, ammunition in baskets once filled with bread. At noon, the first German convoy approached Angers from the east. 30 vehicles, half-tracks leading. They expected nothing. For months they had patrolled these roads as masters. The first explosion came from the Vineyard Hills. A landmine flipped the lead truck like a child's toy. Before the dust settled, gunfire poured from both sides of the road. Maquisards in peasant jackets and captured helmets advanced, shouting orders in clipped French. German soldiers scrambled for cover but found only smoke and confusion. The resistance moved like water, appearing, firing, vanishing. Jean commanded from a stone wall overlooking the road. He fired until the Sten jammed, then drew a revolver. His voice cut through the chaos. Pour la France! The cry echoed down the valley. By dusk, the road to Angers was a graveyard of steel. The few survivors fled toward the city. Jean gathered his men, bloodied and ragged, and began the march forward. They carried no banners, only their weapons and the will to see the next sunrise. When they reached the outskirts of Angers, they saw it. German columns retreating, trucks overloaded with supplies, smoke from the Gestapo headquarters rising in the distance. Civilians peered from doorways, faces gaunt with disbelief. For the first time in 4 years, the swastika over the prefecture was being lowered. Jean entered the square where Hélène had been executed. The bullet scars still marked the wall. He stood there in silence while the others cheered and embraced. The church bell, repaired from melted shell casing, began to ring. Father Emil's cross still lay buried beneath the rubble. Jean knelt and dug with his hands until he felt the smooth wood. He lifted it to the sunlight. The square went quiet. Someone began to sing La Marseillaise. Others joined. The sound swelled until it filled the air like thunder made of human voices. Tears streaked down faces that had forgotten how to cry. That night, Allied tanks rolled into Angers, Shermans covered in dust and flowers. The British officer leading the column saluted the ragged men waiting by the road. "We heard about your bridge," he said. "You started the storm." Jean said nothing. He looked toward the horizon where Saint-Georges once stood and thought of Hélène's voice in the cave. It worked. He smiled. Barely. Then he walked away, disappearing into the narrow streets, swallowed by the noise of liberation. History would not record his last days. Some said he joined the Allied advance toward Paris and died near Chartres. Others claimed he vanished into the woods after the war, unable to return to peace after years of shadows. But in the valleys of Anjou, the story lived on, told by children who had seen the bridge fall and the flag rise again. The river still runs beneath the ruins of Saint-Georges. At dawn, when mist drifts low over the water, fishermen say you can hear the echo of rails bending, the faint rumble of a train that never reached its station, and the distant whisper of voices that refuse to be silenced. They say it sounds like freedom.